Is it? Good morning, all. Hi. Welcome. I'm really quite pleased to launch day 2 of this conference. For those of you who were there with us at the GSD yesterday, we just had a remarkable set of discussions, and we can expect very much more of the same today. I just want to begin by almost immediately turning over the podium to our institutional host today, Ned Friedman, to welcome us. For those of you who are here this morning, he gave us just a remarkable tour of the grounds, and for this interior person, really, not interior psychological, I mean, I don't get outside very much, really did a beautiful job of helping us see not really only the landscape, but the living world around us. So we're most grateful, Ned, and also for your hosting us here today. So I'm going to introduce to the podium our PhD student, Hugo Betting, and he'll introduce the panel, and which includes Ned. And one program note, our wonderful colleague, Mary Kuhn, will be presenting, what do you call that, via, thank you, Rosetta, remotely. She wasn't able to travel today, so great. Thank you, Hugo. Welcome all.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. We would like to thank you for being there so early on this Saturday morning, and to thank again the Arnold Arboretum for closer like that. Okay, I'm going to do that, and to thank the Arnold Arboretum for welcoming us on this second day. So as Ed said, my name is Hugo Betting, and I'm a second-year PhD at the GSD in architectural history. I will try to make it short, as making it short is my duty now, not to spoil you from the pleasure of listening to our speakers. The first panel bears the name of a clearing in the woods. To clear the woods is a way to make space. Without wood, there is no clearing. Humans clear the woods to build with the same material the necessary shelters of their existence. But what happened to the clearing when there is no more wood to clear? New ways of drawing boundaries have to be found, not in order to settle in and against nature, but to protect a transformed nature from our settlement. I would like now to borrow a thought from John D. Lyons, a thought that I know is very dear to Ed. And I suspect this thought is the reason behind the name of this panel. To make a clearing in the woods is also to make an example. Our panelists today engage with precise contexts that aim to make an example. The Biltmore Estate in North Carolina and the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University. Each of these contexts draw boundaries. In other words, each of these contexts secures a piece of land. The latter to collect and preserve nature, the former to restore environmental functions. It is time now to present the participants of this discussion in the order of their appearance. Ned Friedman is the Arnold Professor of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University and the 8th Director of the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University, and will be addressing the engagement of the Arboretum with environmental justice and climate change. As Director of the Arnold Arboretum, Ned Friedman has worked to expand the Arboretum's societal impact through diverse initiatives in public programming, digital communication, enhanced dialogue between scientists and the public, the promotion of scientific scholarship within the living collections, and a reinvigoration of the long-standing relationship between the Arboretum and the biodiversity of Asia. Rosetta S. Elkin is the academic director of the newly established program in landscape architecture at Pratt Institute, and will be addressing the advocacy of the Arnold Arboretum, that is to say, on behalf of who, of what it has been designed. Prior to establishing the MLA program at Pratt, Rosetta Elkin taught at McGill University, the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and the Academie Rietveld. She is also the founding principal of the collaborative studio Practice Landscape at Harvard's Arnold Arboretum. She is a research associate focused on elevating the role of plants in design. Her forthcoming book, Landscape of Retreat, is a fieldwork-based portrait of climate adaptation around the world. Finally, Mary Kuhn, who will join us remotely, is an assistant professor in the English department at the University of Virginia and will focus today on the history of the forest and forestry at the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina. She is a scholar of 19th century American literature and the environmental humanities. Her first book, The Garden Politic, that is forthcoming from New York University Press, focuses on the literary, cultural, and political significance of plant life in 19th century America. She is currently working on a second project about the cultural history of Paris green, an arsenic-based pigment that became a popular insecticide in the late 19th century. I invite you to turn your phone to the QR code you will find on the program for extensive biographies of our participants. And I would like now to call Ned Friedman on the podium to initiate the discussion, to make a clearing without cutting down a tree, to make a clearing that brings light to our subject. Thank you.
Well, it's just terrific to be here. Magnificent day among friends. And as all of you know, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I'm not an Olmsted scholar, but I am actually, let's just say, heavily embedded in an Olmsted landscape every single day of my life. So what I want to do in the next 20 minutes is just unpack some layers, not explicate everything, but open some avenues up for you to think about what this institution means, and actually, as a working Olmsted design, what it should mean in the future, in the next 150 years. This is our sesquicentennial, so the oldest public arboretum in the New World. And we've been doing this work for 150 years, and as I've told people, our indenture with the city of Boston to actually run a park is a 2,000-year indenture. So we're still in our infancy. So let me just begin with our magnolia collections a mile from here at the Honeywell building at the Peak. We're laid out taxonomically. And our birth, which was on March 29th, 1872. This land was given to Harvard, and you can see the indenture with Harvard. Like all legal documents of the time, it has lots of legalese. It's handwritten, but you can see said party of the second part shall devote the remainder of the said blah, blah, blah income, and basically support of an arboretum, as you can see, called the Arnold Arboretum. And if you continue to read, you'll see that we are instructed to, the Arboretum shall contain, as far as is practicable, all the trees, shrubs, and herbaceous plants, either indigenous or exotic, which can be raised in the open air at the said West Roxbury. And that is exactly what we've been doing for 150 years. It goes on to say that the money will, the endowment that's held by Harvard will support a professor called the Arnold Professor, that's me, and it's an amazing thing in 150 years to be one of 8 people who's had this gig, but it's one of the greatest honors and joys of my life. So let me unpack our birth. The land that the original part of the Arnold Arboretum sits on was actually bequeathed and promised to Harvard in 1842 by Benjamin Bussey, whose statue can be found on campus. But this land sat for decades unused because there was no money associated with it. But James Arnold, a whaling merchant in New Bedford who did not have a specific Harvard association, made out his will. He did not have his wife and child had predeceased him. He wanted to create an arboretum. And the trustees of his estate were Harvard associated and Jamaica Plain associated. And they very, very wisely decided that this should be where the money partnered with the land. And so the estate came to the Arboretum in 1872, and Charles Sprague Sargent was appointed its first director. Now, I want to address the asterisk because it's important. A significant portion of Bussey's wealth was generated in the triangle trade, trading in commodities produced by enslaved people, including sugar, cotton, and coffee. There's no question that the people who built the wealth that this land sits on did not acquiesce to it or have any actual knowledge of it. So it's very important. I encourage you, every web page at the Arnold Arboretum has a link at the bottom where our archivist and I have unpacked much more of our entanglement with slavery as well as eugenics. So the other thing I want to note is that it's important to know that there's about 7,000 years of archaeological history that tells us about the different peoples that have transited this property and have moved through it, occasionally stayed here. There are archaeological sites from about 4,000 years ago with hearths, so we know people were actually here. Not just moving through. And it's all been written up. There are amazing Boston reports, but it's 7,000 years of history. And we dig a lot of holes, so we found a lot of stuff. One of the best archaeological sites in Boston. So what happened? Charles Sprague Sargent gets to work, and he turns immediately to Frederick Law Olmsted to design the Arboretum. And here's this thing wholly owned by Harvard, but there is no way there's enough money for Olmsted, a man of unlimited ambitions, and Sargent, equally ambitious, to create what they want. So they did something that only happens once in the history of Harvard University. They actually convinced Harvard to give something away. You know, the flow of money is never in that direction. But Harvard was convinced to give all of the land to the city of Boston at no cost. And then what would happen is the deal was we get a lease back, 1,000 years, renewable once. So this is 10 years into our history. We're a 2010-year institution. That changes everything about how we think about planning for the future. We're not asking, yes, we ask what's going to happen tomorrow. Yes, we ask what's happening in a decade. But everything we're planting right now is for people you will never know because they're your great-grandchildren. We're thinking about 100 and 150 and 200 years now. And we have to think about the ecology of what's going to be around 200 years from now. And we had this lease. It's renewable once. We send a check downtown for $1 a year. And basically, everyone who works here in this park works for Harvard. And we control the property. We're responsible for all of the care of this extraordinary collection of trees. All of the equipment here, as I tell people, there's no professor at Harvard who has a 90-foot lift other than me. I have bulldozers. I have the best stuff. And the city of Boston is responsible for the maintenance of roads, sidewalks, walls. In other words, they own the hardscape. Now, what I want you to know is how it works. We are a co-production of Harvard University and the city of Boston, but we have no direct annual funding from either the city of Boston or Harvard University. Every dollar that is spent here on everything is philanthropic. It is endowments held by Harvard, it is gifts, it is your memberships. There's no other source of money. So even though we run a city park, we get $0 a year in any operating budget from the city. So let's just unpack a couple of things. Who are we? And I'm going to say plants, landscape, and people. So we're clearly one of Frederick Law Olmsted's greatest designs at the peak of his powers. And if you go through the Fairstead materials and you start to look at the topographies that he was dealing with and the roadways he was trying to figure out to read that topography, this one remarkably unsuccessful attempt early in the days, and thank goodness this wasn't built. The way he played with the sinuosity of curves and reveals and view sheds, the way he interacted with Charles Sprague Sargent to lay out the taxonomic system of the 1880s, the actual collections, the Oaks would be here, the Fagus collection there, the Juglin's collection there. This is a museum of living objects where each room, each chamber is a different taxonomy. And you can begin to see as things come to take shape, how Olmsted is thinking about it. And then I want to reveal what he was working with. He was working with old sheep pasture. There are almost no trees here. This is a blank landscape with a few in-pockets, in-holdings of native woodlands. That's Bussey Hill, if you can believe it, for those of you who know Bussey Hill. So we are a cherished public park in Boston's Emerald Necklace, and as I tell people, if we do our horticultural well, we don't have to tell people how to feel. Children will do cartwheels because they're here. We are Harvard's Museum of Trees, a museum of living objects intended to be studied. We are a scientific institution. As a research institution, we're studying everything in this building and on the grounds, from global change to genomics. Hundreds of scientists are working in the living collections. Every year we have projects that range from the gamut. not just plants, but animal wildlife, you name it, it's being done here. I'm one of 3 faculty who are based here from Harvard. There's a person who studies the evolution of floral color, Robert Hopkins. We have an ecosystems ecologist who actually works on nitrogen fixation and elevated CO2 in forested ecosystems. This building is filled with scientists. And 11 years ago, 12 years ago when I opened up, there were no chairs, there were no lab equipment, and there were no people in here. This was an empty shell in 2011. We're home to 16,000 curated woody plant accessions. Every one of them has provenance. And we're home to 8 Plant Collections Network national collections, maple, hickory, beech, and on. These are the finest synoptic collections of their kind in the world. To give you an idea of what one of these collections might look like, when it comes to the maples, there are 63 species of maples growing on the grounds there. There's no other place in the world you could ever go to see that many species of maples in one fell swoop. It's extraordinary. We're a safe harbor for species that are extinct in the wild, like the Franklin tree. We are a force for conservation and fighting extinction around the world. We work with our partners globally to get germplasm in a safe harbor before things go extinct in the wild, like the paperbark maple, which is under considerable threat. We're an urban biodiversity hotspot. We have more than 70 species of native bees that live at the Arnold Arboretum, 6 species of bats, and 188 species of birds have been observed here. We're home to the finest horticulturalists and arborists in the world. We are an intrepid group of plant explorers, and we are always out acquiring new germplasm to bring and nourish from a seed into the collections as a sapling. We're friends and colleagues with the peoples and cultures of the world, and I want you to know we reciprocate. Not only do we go to China and have been going, first part of Harvard to engage with China, but right before the pandemic, 3 weeks in the Appalachians, where we invited our Chinese colleagues to bring North American material to Chinese gardens, Beijing, Chengdu, you name it, Kunming. We want to share back. That's how we do things when we work with our partners. And we were one of the only botanical gardens or arboreta worldwide to remain open throughout the pandemic. I turned to my colleagues in the School of Public Health who were dealing with this stuff on TV every day. We put out the manifesto in the Post. Stay open. Public grounds like this have to stay open, most closed. And the New York Times very nicely picked it all up and told New York City, open up your green spaces like the Arnold Arboretum. And to give you some idea of the numbers, we installed 1 gate counter of our 14 entrances. We don't charge admission. Anyone can come in from anywhere. We just crossed 2 million entries in 2.5 years of pandemic through one of our 14 entrances. We estimate some 9 million visits during a pandemic have taken place here. We are home to the vibrant human diversity of Boston, and I can tell you our demographic information from 2019 indicates that nearly half of the people whose cell phones were tracked in the Arnold Arboretum, anonymized, were people of color. There is no other cultural institution in Boston that even comes close. So we are an agent of democracy. We are free and open to all, and it is the simple acknowledgement of saying hello, of passing someone by and smiling, that creates the kinds of bonds that are so essential to a functioning and vibrant city and democracy. We are a public health institution. I would be remiss if I didn't make it clear. We are part of the healthcare system of Boston. In fact, with my colleagues in the School of Public Health at Harvard, I have an 80-page commissioned report that lists all of the mental and physical benefits of time spent in green space. There are hundreds of studies. So during a pandemic, when it was at its most dire, the reason we didn't close is we didn't think of ourselves as a botanical garden. We thought of ourselves as a healthcare institution. And hospitals don't close during the pandemic, and the Arboretum would never close during a pandemic. And Olmsted certainly understood pandemics from his work. This place is a safe place, and it is essential for everyone. So we think of ourselves very differently than many botanical gardens. We're educators dedicated to introducing urban school children to nature. We have a beautiful set of programs and collaborations with cultural arts institutions. And so we host everything from the ART to the Boston Ballet, you name it, it's happening here. We're a community committed to combating climate change. Outside is the largest solar installation at Harvard. It's the 3rd of our solar installations, and it is only solar installation with a native plant solar meadow collected germplasm here locally in the Commonwealth to date. So it's an extraordinary biodiversity hotspot that's designed to prevent insect declines in Boston. We're now committed in the next 5 years to eliminating all internal combustion engine equipment. Those are our new battery deck mowers, a fleet of e-cargo bikes. 8 of them are already deployed, and 5 years from now, we will not be putting fuel into anything. We're a community giving voice to nature. We're a community giving voice to plants, and we're a community giving voice to magnificent organisms. So those are some of the layers I want to unpack. Now, here we are in our 150th, and I want to ask the simple question, where are we going? And that question is important because I'm thinking about the next 150. And what we did is we spent a lot of time asking, what are we going to say and what are we going to do? And we have a vision that is centered around 2 goals. Renew our founding public promise of environmental justice in the landscape. Of course, Olmsted would have used different words, but the intentions were the same. And we are going to double down on combating climate change and extinction. So what's our plan of action? Well, when it comes to renewing our promise of environmental justice, one of the things you will discover when the city owns the hardscape and the state controls it is that entry to the Arboretum is inequitable. On the left is one of the entries from an environmental justice neighborhood to the Arnold Arboretum, controlled by the MBTA. I have no power over it, but I've partnered with people in the neighborhoods. And we will take it over so that it isn't maintained by the city or the state, and we will make sure that the horticulture is at its top and that it's clean, there's no drug usage, but that's baked in social and environmental injustice, and it's not acceptable. It is not acceptable. And that inspired us to think hard about what we would do with all of our entrances, which essentially underwent the 20th century decline and mediocrity of all public parks. Olmsted's grand carriageways turned into parking lots with asphalt. Do not park here, do not do that. And Gary was super helpful in actually launching this initiative and getting us to think about things and to actually dream big enough, I would say, to actually think that we're going to do 5 entrances. And we've already raised all the design money, and we're working with Michael van Valkenburg Associates, and we are going to re-envision entry into the Arboretum by decentering the automobile, and we are going to actually think about what it means to gather, to connect, to embark, to reshape our view sheds, to make sure that when you see something, we are getting you into our museum galleries in deeply meaningful ways. And at the same time, we're working with Rosetta, Kiel Mo, our Horsley Witten Engineering and Environmental Solutions Group, and we're going to take a new space that's not part of the formal Arboretum. It actually came to us less than 30 years ago. It's actually just wild land, okay? It's an urban wild, and it's never had trails in it to get you in there. We are going to create a new, beautiful, elevated boardwalk made of black locust, our own carbon dioxide, not tropical hardwoods. Our carbon dioxide is going to build this beautiful structure. It's going to be integrated into an entire pedestrian and cyclist road system that actually goes from Roslindale downtown. So this is not only about environmental justice, it's also about the future of movement in the city of Boston. And it's going to be magnificent. And I have the scale model upstairs. I stare at it every day, and I can't wait to see this built. And it will activate this space that never had any way of entering it other than the shabby entrance over at Washington Street. And now you'll be able to actually, this is the environmental justice neighborhood where the new entrance is being built by the city. And now, right next to the most deserving and under-resourced people in Boston, they will have the most extraordinary feature that's new to the Boston City Parks. And we collaborate. We work with everybody. And even in the city of Boston alone, this is just a partial list of the different organizations I have to work with, and we do collaborate with. And now more than ever, the city of Boston is really coming to the fore in actually investing in our perimeter and making some of these things that are extraordinary happen. When it comes to climate change, we were built when it was happening, but no one knew it. And there is no irrigation when I got here, and we have a museum collection. Imagine the MFA without backup generators on a cold day when a storm blows through and you open the windows. That doesn't work. So we have to control things. We've done one of 3 major projects. We've had to install irrigation for drought mitigation. The second one just started last week, and the third one has been accelerated. The drought this summer, just a reminder, after 2016, there is no way to keep this collection alive for 150 years without getting water to the plants. That means also we need increased horticultural staffing, which means, again, I have to make sure people understand we need endowments. There is no other money here. And we need this not just because of climate change, it's global change. How many invasive pests have I had to fight off? Emerald ash borer just came, right, a few years ago. Now we have beech leaf disease. My first week on the job, Asian longhorn beetle that eats maples, the finest maple collection right here. It is harder to grow a tree now than it has ever been, and I mean significantly harder. So if we want magnificent trees, you got to pay for it, and you have to have the finest horticulturists in the world. And as a research institution, we need to be training the next generation. I've just raised the money for a pilot program to have global change postdoctoral fellows based here studying global change in temperate trees. And we need to have more of these endowed so that the next generation starts the fight even more aggressively than the current generation is. So simply put, I'll just put it to you, why must we act? Access to nature is a human right, and combating global change is a human obligation. Thank you.
Hi. Hello, everyone. That was so inspiring, and it's so rare that Ned and I get to speak one after another. So you'll probably hear some of the same, I don't know, words or I suppose feelings is a better word. And so another disclaimer, as you can tell from my title, I'll speak about landscape advocacy at the Arnold Arboretum. But first, I'd like to admit, for the organizers, wherever Ed is, that before I had a lecture, let alone a set of cohesive remarks or a paper, sometimes that happens, I had a title. So I'm going to regard a space like this as a collegial kind of opportunity for dialogue and experimentation, and let go of my abstract and stick with my title for everyone who had to endure that abstract. If this nation has a long way to go before all of our people are truly created equally, without regard to race, religion, or national origin, it has even farther to go before achieving anything that remotely resembles equal treatment of other creatures who call this land home before humans ever set foot upon it. Now that humans have not only set foot, but pose a major threat to each other, to other ways of being, to other creatures, it is also time to question the role of design in either facilitating that treatment or working really hard against it. Now, according to Webster's dictionary, advocacy is defined as any action that speaks in favor of, recommends, argues for a cause, supports, defends, or pleads on behalf of others. Let's bear that last bit in mind, on behalf of others, and pair that with the excerpt aforementioned in the quote, equal treatment of other creatures. I'll get back to this othering, but first, there's more to the definition. Advocacy stems from Roman law and references a profession, a calling, a métier of a person who pleads cases in a court of justice. Elle est avocate means in French, she's a lawyer. Where I'm from in Quebec, advocacy is not a mushy kind of design language. It is legally binding, it is an agreement with regulatory prominence. It is law and it is lawyer. It is not a word thrown around easily. The Latin etymology sheds a little more light on our very slippery topic. Away from the bounds of pleading, common to the Webster's use, the origin of the word brings our attention instead to advocatus, one called to aid another, a witness stemming from ad, meaning, of course, to, and vocare, to call, which is related to vox, voice. So I'd like to amend Webster's for now, for the next 20 minutes, maybe 17, and offer another more fitting definition. To advocate is to give voice. The images you're considering describe the relationships between plants and people at the Arnold Arboretum, but there's more. These relationships are not taken for granted, as Ned so beautifully explicated for us. They're not settled, they're not accepted, they're not sentimental, and they are not token. They describe the binding commitment between human and plant life that was created by design. I find many of the images from the Arnold that I take or that I download from Ned's Instagram restless, stuck as they are in between stages, in times of growth and decay, in moments of flash, in contrast to periods that seem to last for months and months at a time. But that's just the surface. Each plant traces the journey of tree seeds across time, stored in pockets and gripped in sweaty hands, folded into neat packages that hold just one seed from the thousands underfoot elsewhere. Thus, what Olmsted and Sargent created or designed when they set aside these 280 acres was a long-term relationship that countered the quick-fix expansionism of their times, a relationship set up by the plants, fungi, and bacteria that make their own history across the world, quite apart or entirely entangled with our so-called histories. The Arnold Arboretum is a register of plant-based time, or the change unfolding in our airs and under our feet that might temper our fictitious hierarchy and invite more equitable relationships. These relations are what bind culture together. These relations are our older relatives, the ones who came before us and taught us how to live. These relations are a struggle to preserve what remains and the most precious effort to characterize the fact of habitat loss and species extinction across the globe. This, for instance, this hop hornbeam finds home at the Arnold among thousands of other plant species. While its habitat, you would walk by it and not even notice it, its habitat is being depleted, concretized, pacified, poorly designed, or more often, stolen and taken. I call the Arboretum a register because it discloses in real time a living record of species diversity and potential loss. And it does so by relying on the ceaseless advocacy between keepers and their lands, between scientists and the public, between institutional and municipal budgets, which means the Arnold Arboretum was designed to give voice to the voiceless. In this case, the voices are non-sentient beings we call plants. Using the Arnold Arboretum as his muse and plant life as his guide, I'd like to imagine that Olmsted took the opportunity here to create a model of care that extends beyond the site at hand, extends across global landscapes, and certainly across typical park-like timescales. When Olmsted advocated for a publicly accessible private arboretum, he set into motion one of the most radically distinct and anti-capitalist models. His design was quite unlike his other park projects because he took the opportunity to center plant life as a partner in the indenture between Harvard University and the city of Boston. Olmsted negotiated the 1,000-year lease agreement that Ned so beautifully described to forge a bond between the city of Boston and Harvard University. But he also forged a model of conservation far beyond the landscape underfoot. The timescale, 1,000 years, was a clear nod to the lifespan of trees, not humans, which allows me to dream about Olmsted's intentions. Moreover, the indenture is renewable once, as Ned mentioned, setting up a legally binding agreement between plants and people. and across time, binding generation to generation in the care of a public landscape for 2,000 years while setting aside land from development, the blueprint for a 2,000-year conservation strategy? Did Olmsted not only project the enlargement of towns and the greediness of urbanism, but also perhaps the shocking exploitation of lands far, far away from his commissions? For me, having spent a lot of time here, I can appreciate how Olmsted subverted the endorsed model of conservation, reaching further into his imagination. What I mean to say is that the Arboretum itself, as a landscape, helps advocate for other voiceless landscapes. Let me explain further. 1 in every 10 plants at the Arnold Arboretum holds conservation status, which means that there are over 1,200 individual plants today, maybe more tomorrow, that are critically endangered, threatened, or extinct in the wild as habitat loss is sped up by runaway urbanism, corrupt planning, the market economy, and the extractive forces of voracious capitalism. Because the plants live on here, out there, botanists can advocate for conservation across other lands threatened by development, from the Ozarks to Mongolia. Advocacy now hums with relevance, perhaps. Out of this place, individual trees are given voice to speak for their threatened relatives. The Arnold Arboretum is an anomaly in the mainstreaming of Olmsted's portfolio, because here, the collaborative potential for plant life presages conservation in a time of rapid extinction. This was accomplished through legal indenture, as you now know, led by a belief in non-material relations, which is what I'm trying to argue, antiform. This is everywhere in evidence here at the Arboretum, but to see it, you first have to take a deeper historical dive into its making and move away from the failures of plan. There is a first terrestrial birth that inspires the Arboretum grounds. Like the entire Northeast region, the land is the result, thank you, of glacial scouring and scattered drumlins deposited after the last ice age. If you can imagine holding a handful of that sand from this elevated beach scour, you'd be holding almost entirely the remnants of the great ice sheet as it gouged its way southward, breaking off ledges of rock, dragging broken pieces frozen in its creeping mass, shaping Cape Cod and strewing the land with boulders for miles. At the end of the last glacial period, 11,000 years before the present, the land itself rose when freed from the immense weight of the ice sheet. For a time, the shoreline extended way past the Boston Harbor Islands, as most of you know, but water from melting glaciers gradually raised the sea level. The shore retreated westward. By 6,000 before present, the bed of the Charles River filled with water. The Harbor Islands remained landlocked. Boreal forests of pine and spruce gave way to deciduous hardwood forests as temperatures warmed. The soils all around us are part of a geological history, and they are here to see. They are not hiding under concrete. And so, in your imaginary handful, you can imagine what has been jumbled, transported, selected, and retained. Harder to hold are the drumlins, the numerous drumlins, ridges, and elongated hills that elevated and dampen across more than human scales. So this image you're considering provides a meticulous topographic record of Boston that explicates, or the image prior, that it explicates pre-industrial land use. That Boston is a relic of settler colonialism made up of over 60% landfill stolen from the hills is a story of our past and a legacy of the last century, but this is not the story I want to tell. I'd rather share the story of landscape advocacy that did not extract to advance, and it's the legacy of giving voice. This narrative appreciates the landscapes for its ups and downs, for its geologic past, its undulations as a planetary reality that engenders these long-term relationships I'm referring to. That is the very heart of what landscape architecture is as a field and a practice. Landscape architects working with curiosity and interest on the interactions of the built and living environments in equal measure. At the Arnold Arboretum, we call 3 of those drumlins Bussey, Hemlock, and Peters Hill. They are a remnant of a larger erased regional landscape of undulating, swelling, sloping life, grounded in the contours of the Earth's past. Olmsted frequently toured the grounds with Sargent, often on horseback, a speed that allowed them to appreciate together this subtle topography I'm describing, and then imagine its transformation. Sargent advocated for that 1,000-year lease we keep talking about, but he also in turn created a 1,000-year development freeze. And this is respect for the land, outside of personal gain. Olmsted imagined not only what the world could be in his time, but what it could be in the future. Today, we might take a cue from advocacy that appreciates the landscape for its non-sentient beings, to treasure others without history, in the careful planting within a geologic past, a landscape of undulations and changes that engenders these long-term relationships, prioritizing these relations I'm describing over form, because to design out of place signals a more equitable future, because it includes others without history. If I have time, and I know that I'm not going to go over, but I am getting little mentions, I would like to describe this term others, brought to us from the earlier quote and the definition of advocacy. If you recall, Webster's claimed on behalf of others, while Ted Strong pleads for equal treatment of other creatures. These insights inspire me, also because it may or may not be a paper, to bring together 2 very different scholars that I'd like to shed some light on in order to unpack the kind of advocacy I'm interested in. In his 1982 book, Europe and the People Without History, Eric Wolf captures how scholars, historians, anthropologists, and sociologists, we could add landscape architects, package societies and entire civilizations and continents into neat boxes for analytical purposes, portraying them as self-contained entities without connections to each other and to the larger worlds around them. Wolf's People Without History was the first and foremost formulation of how European history is stunted and flattened by the failure to see the world as a whole, a totality, a system. This, of course, as we all hopefully know and call out in our work, is precisely how capitalism stays afloat, nested as it is in the consumerist enclosures that reveal modernity as a world without outsides, lost to the craft of attention, of non-Western values and spirituality that are deemed unfamiliar and therefore unproductive. When knowledge cannot be exploited, it leads to uneven capitalist developments. My other scholar, according to Wendy Macoun's genus, colonization was not just physical, it lies in the subjugation of plant-based knowledge. This dislocation is fueled by making traditional plant use appear primitive, in lawfully reorganizing land title, in the scrutiny of healing and the rise of pharmaceuticals, in showy horticultural traditions and choice fruits, in funding the shift from growing to producing food, in writing one history and refusing others. And what I appreciate about Genus's thesis is what is most commonly left out of this struggle that we call human, is how power advances by destroying plant-based knowledge. As most of you know, the trend when Olmsted and Sargent were working toward landscape advocacy was to flatten to advance, to extract from the landscape to establish the highest commercial respect. But the Arboretum is set radically against that trend, not only in landscape and through conservation, but because of plant life. Plants as park makers that inspire human advocacy bring us a little closer to these other creatures and a little closer to each other. To treat a park as an object or an outline is to continue to etch colonial abuse into design, and thus into public relations. To even call it a park simply labels to advance, undermining the landscape that is made and unmade through multitudinous relations. To treat the park as infrastructure alone commodifies it and feeds greedy capitalism. My use of the concept of capitalism requires a little clarification, since I've now said it approximately 5 times. The capitalist mode of production may be motivated everywhere, by the same dynamic interplay of accumulation and labor power. Some people sitting here know much more about it than I do, but this interplay can take many guises. I emphasize the combination of capitalist ownership and management by managers and hired labor that tends to disable or undo other modes of production. So prediction goes into a kind of stasis when an efficient model is reached. So capitalism undoes relationships, or at least superimposes new ones. Mow and blow. But in Olmstedian terms, parks were anti-capitalist, and landscape making contested and resisted the flattening pace of development, and the rituals of wealth easily won. But it could not do so on its own. It did not have voice to do so on its own. No ecology survives the speeding up and scaling up of industrial capitalism. Meanwhile, only 250 years or so into the indenture, the Arnold Arboretum remains free of charge and free of commercial interests. Our position as a generously accessible public landscape in the heart of Boston comes with a responsibility to protect the future from the present, beyond the confines of its park status, to give voice to others without history. The global trajectory of simplified systems has shown us what the reckless consumption of resources looks like, but is often more subtle, like in this image. Some of you walked through Walter Street Gate and saw Bussy Brook there. This is Bussy Brook in the early 90s, channelized, culverted as it is mown to the water plant edge, obediently mechanized. As some of you might have seen today, you will see a very different public landscape now that recovers connectivity with place, processes with wetter wets and drier dries that actually make for more or less access to humans. But walk there and try not to care. So at the beginning of my talk, I mentioned a seed carried in a sweaty palm or a dusty pocket. And now imagine it settled into the silty glacial loam I was describing. Again, maybe that was in your hand. And that seed is what is cared for over the generations. Visited, called on for research, witnessing hurricanes in a haste, and slowly adapting to the warmer atmosphere before we even knew it. A living specimen that took root in our great-grandparents' time and endures for public attention today. Scientific inquiry tomorrow, and habitat for multitudinous species forever, with or without humankind. A gift economy, I'll call it, between species with legal binding dimensions. So I will just leave you with a question. Can we learn to love parks by giving voice to others without history? Thank you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm really sorry I can't be there today in person. I am zooming in from Charlottesville, Virginia, which is located on the unceded territory of the Monacan people. I lived in Boston for 9 years before moving down here. And I'm especially sorry not to be able to join you at the Arnold Arboretum, which was one of my favorite Latin destinations when I lived there. My thanks to Kat Chavez, Paige Johnson, Samantha Page, and Matt Smith for all your work on the conference, and especially for making it so seamless to watch the talks and to participate remotely. My thanks too to Ed for the invitation and for drawing together such a wonderful array of perspectives. My talk today is entitled Approaching Olmsted Forest, and I'm going to share my screen now. Nestled in the North Carolina mountains, a few miles from the thrumming city of Asheville, sits the Biltmore, George W. Vanderbilt's sprawling late 19th century estate that today is a popular tourist attraction. Visitors come for house tours, but they also come to roam the expansive gardens designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, stop in at the winery, to view gallery exhibitions, and to go shopping. Hotels on the property are framed as cozy mountain retreats and frequently cost $500 a night or more to stay there. The website refers to visits to the property as journeys. As I began research for this talk, I took a trip to the Biltmore, where I learned a ticket to wander the gardens and grounds cost $90, $85 plus a $5 service fee. Had I desired entry to the house, it would have cost a total of $125. The private nature of the Biltmore means that even today, perhaps especially today, those who can enjoy Olmsted's gardens on the estate are those who can afford to pay. This stands in contrast to many of Olmsted's public projects, which sought to be more widely accessible, such as the Arnold Arboretum, which we were just talking about. Of course, as yesterday's talks emphasized, public was not a neutral term, and we can read into this term histories of dispossession, racialization, class, gender, and ableism. Olmsted was drawn to working on the Biltmore in part because of the freedom that Vanderbilt gave him to shape the landscape, including the ability to experiment with scientific forestry. My own interest in the Biltmore started with the 18th and 19th century history of the North Carolina forest. As a literary critic by training, I first encountered this forest in the writings of the late 19th century author Charles Chesnutt, who recounted the devastating effects of the turpentine industry on the state's environment. But he also showed how late 19th century conservationist responses to that devastation failed to break the systems of repression tied to the forest industries. This is the point where the history that Chesnutt was describing intersects with the history of the Biltmore, a site now credited as being the quote-unquote cradle of forestry. In a report to George W. Vanderbilt dated June 16, 1890, Frederick Law Olmsted wrote that, quote, "The management of forests is soon to be the subject of great national economic importance." For Olmsted and for his client, this was not an abstract claim. Vanderbilt had recently purchased a large tract of land in western North Carolina, and plans were underway to develop the sprawling estate with a vast building footprint and expansive gardens and grounds. In joining the project, Olmsted proposed that part of the estate be dedicated to scientific forestry. Vanderbilt had originally wanted a park. In his words, in Olmsted's words, "The undertaking now to be entered upon at Biltmore will be the first of its kind in the country to be carried on methodically upon an extensive scale. For this reason, he wished to proceed systematically and make sure they kept meticulous records of their attempts to sustainably, beautifully, and profitably manage the forest." My talk today focuses on the history of the forest and forestry at the Biltmore, a project that brought together some of the most influential figures in American forest management, and that was seen by many as a bellwether for the potential to extrapolate these practices to the national management of woodlands. It's very much a work in progress, near the beginning than the end, so I'm looking forward to your feedback and thoughts on where to take this. The appeal of scientific forestry lay in the promise of a sustainable yield of profitable wood, and in the promise that such sustainable harvesting would allow for the preservation of forest spaces deemed vital to recreation and health. When he agreed to work on the Biltmore project, Olmsted believed that the private estate could advance public opinion on the idea of sustainable forestry, helping set a course for land management in future years. And on that, he was not wrong. The project helped launch Gifford Pinchot's career as the first head of the newly established U.S. Forest Service, and the Biltmore Forest School, which drew students from 1898 until 1909, educated dozens of men who would go on to become influential in the Forest Service. The Biltmore School brought together students interested in maximizing lumber profits and those interested in preserving forests for their aesthetic or intrinsic value. Yet, as historians of conservation have taught us, the conservation movement was frequently aligned with white supremacist ideology. The management of the forest and the management of people were part of the same biopolitical process. Pinchot, Roosevelt, and other champions of scientific forestry supported eugenic organizations. What I want to illustrate in today's talk is that the work of the Biltmore can help us see how conservation continued many antebellum logics in terms of labor, access, and power. While conservation signaled a shift towards government regulation and control, private business interests and the question of profitability remain central deciding factors in land management. The shift to scientific forestry and forest management continue to replicate antebellum racial and class dynamics. What was the land before it was the Biltmore? Largely farming. Vanderbilt bought over 600 individual parcels of land, totaling over 125,000 acres to make his estate. So the house itself is located in Block 3 in the sort of bottom right-hand quadrant of the slide, and sort of the black building just above the writing Block 3. This land included a large mountainous tract purchased from the pro-slavery, pro-succession North Carolina State Senator Thomas Clingman, after whom Clingman's Dome in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park is named. This is land that Edith Vanderbilt would later sell to create the Pisgah National Forest. Clingman had bought the land from Zechariah Candler, about whom little information remains. It is still unclear, at least to me, whether Candler was the first white property owner or whether he bought the land from previous settlers. But the land that includes Pisgah National Forest, Asheville, and the Biltmore had long been Cherokee territory. So this gray, the gray area here is Cherokee territory that extended across parts of Virginia, West Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And that red arrow is pointing to Asheville. A large swath of land in western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee was claimed by U.S. government treaty in 1791. Other histories of this land remain in traces. Biltmore Forest historian Bill Alexander has identified a Black farming community established in the 1870s, a half-mile from the eventual site of the Biltmore House. The community was organized around the Shiloh AME Church of Zion, and when they sold the land to Vanderbilt in 1889, Vanderbilt purchased a nearby tract of land for relocation. Further afield in the Pisgah Forest, forester Carl Schenck recalled frequently encountering locals on the Vanderbilt property. It dawned upon me, he recalls, that the real owner of Pisgah Forest was not George W. Vanderbilt, but these mountaineers who were using his property for farming, pasturing, and hunting at their own pleasure. Such activities were not in keeping with the goals of scientific forestry, as we'll see. Olmsted's interest in setting a precedent for forest management at the Biltmore speaks to the fact that scientific forestry was heralded at the end of the 19th century as a way to address the country's problem with deforestation. Woods had been clear-cut for agriculture and lumber with little thought to long-term consequences. In New England, aggressive clear-cutting quickly decimated forested landscapes and reshaped riverine ecologies. Henry David Thoreau, for instance, recounted the sheer scale of lumber operations while traveling in Maine. In Michigan, 1840 was the start of a 90-year period retrospectively dubbed the cutover, in which over 90% of the state's old-growth forest was chopped down. The common process of girdling trees allowed farmers to more easily fell them. Girdling involved stripping a ring of bark from around the tree, depriving it of the ability to transport sap, and thus slowly strangling it. And it's depicted in the foreground in that the foregrounded tree here in this accompanying painting by George Harvey. And in California, over a third of the state's trees were already thought to be deforested by 1870. North Carolina had a particularly grim history with deforestation. The resinous longleaf pine, endemic to much of the state, had already been harvested for turpentine for over a century by the time the Biltmore project began. In the piney regions of North Carolina and in much of the southern pine belt that sprawled south to Georgia, Florida, and west to Texas, the lumber industry followed in the wake of an already destructive turpentine industry. The thing to note is that Olmsted himself was well aware of this history. He had witnessed it decades earlier when he traveled through the South, noting that planters often hired out their enslaved workers to turpentine plantations because it was more profitable than having them work in the cotton fields. The labor conditions for emancipated Black turpentine workers during Reconstruction did not shift radically, as systems of debt peonage and penal labor ensured the continuous production of turpentine and lumber. Yet what did profoundly shift was a conversation about the need to conserve and protect forests. The founding of Yellowstone National Park in 1872 prompted conversations about the need to protect land at the state and national level. The Commission of State Parks in New York was founded in the wake of this news, despite not having established any state land as a park yet. And the conservative periodical Southern Cultivator ran articles about the need for forest preservation. As early as 1887, Bernard Fernald, the chief of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Forestry Division, was positing that nothing less than civilization itself was at stake in developing forest management on a national scale. Americans became increasingly conscious of these effects, partially as a result of the rise in tourism to wooded regions. Vanderbilt had chosen the Biltmore location in part because of what Olmsted called its good air. In fact, that's a turpentine hacking the base of a longleaf pine to get the resinous sound. In fact, one of the first sanitariums for pulmonary conditions in the US was established in nearby Asheville in 1875, and subsequent tuberculosis sanitariums were established in other woodsy places like upstate New York. Health tourism convinced middle-class Americans of the importance and value of preserving forested landscapes. But the land that Vanderbilt had bought had been largely worked over for agricultural purposes, and any trees of economic value in the area had already been cut by the time of Vanderbilt's purchase. As Olmsted himself recognized, the forest was, quote, culled again and again until the demand at last came to be such that nearly every sound tree of the territory, now forming the Biltmore estate, that would measure a foot in diameter at the butt, could be felled and its trunk drawn to a mill with profit. The result was that the trees that now constituted the Biltmore forest were the, quote, refuge of the refuse of the repeated cullings of the original forest. So part of Olmsted's scientific forestry was to make forests profitable again. One of the first elements that Olmsted espoused was the planting of 300 acres of white pine trees. Most of the young trees died the spring after they were planted. Elsewhere in the vast tract of land, the forestry team ran into other issues. Their first big cut was in an area of the property called Big Creek, which contained the only virgin stand of trees on the property. But there was no accessible route, either road or water, for getting the cut timber out. The team turned to a splash dam to move the logs, a process that ended up causing severe damage to the creek banks, and the flora and fauna that had resided there. The effects were not confined to the Vanderbilt property either, impacting how local people could use the creek downstream. And as the logs spilled into the larger river connecting Big Creek to the Broad River, they caused damage to the riverbanks of neighboring farms. So forestry work in North Carolina brought both Pinchot and Schenck into frequent contact with neighboring farmers and local mountaineers. Some of the most valuable stands of trees on Vanderbilt's property were located in remote areas that necessitated access through the land of small farmers. Of these mountaineers, Pinchot wrote, they regarded this country as their country, their common. And that was not surprising, for they needed everything usable in it, pasture, fish, game, to supplement the very meager living they were able to scratch from the soil of their little clearings, which often were no clearings at all, but mere deadenings, filled with the whitened skeletons of trees killed by girdling. For Pinchot, these mountain folk were to be managed, their land used frequently in direct conflict with the forestry team's objectives. I've talked about the broader impacts of deforestation, of forestry, and of the Biltmore construction itself, and how the people who lived, farmed, and fished there were at best a secondary consideration and frequently seen as a hindrance to conservationist ideals. When I visited the Biltmore last month, I went as a tourist. Arriving in the early afternoon on a sweltering Labor Day weekend, I drove slowly through the gatehouse and up Olmsted's meandering 3-mile approach road. I parked in a sprawling parking lot, one of several on site, and made my way to the carefully constructed first view of the Biltmore estate. What I first noticed, beyond the behemoth chateau, were the crowds. The property was heaving with tourists, and I was ushered down a crowded path towards the metal detector in the house. As my garden and grounds ticket did not grant me access to any interior spaces, I made a beeline for the estate gardens. As I wandered down towards the vast pond, I encountered a placard in each space recounting Olmsted's vision for each garden. So something that looked kind of like this. And here too, I found crowds. Seeing so many people walking the grounds that Olmsted envisioned, I was struck again by the fact that this wasn't a public space. Instead, the estate felt like a well-oiled tourist operation. An employee snapped my photo under a tree as I queued for the entrance and sent the image to the email I'd registered when purchasing a garden ticket. This image, my figure transposed onto one of the rooms in the estate that I did not see, was marketed as a memento I could purchase for $20. Exiting the estate involved a journey that made the 3-mile approach road look short. So here's a map of the property that they hand out to you. And you enter in the bottom right, and you drive up the approach road, and between the sort of light green and the dark green is the road that takes you to the exit. So to leave the parking lot, which is in the foreground, the bottom center, You go by, you have a sort of last look at the Biltmore House, and then you have this sort of scenic meandering between the light green and the dark green, kind of following the curve of the river. Driving at the requisite speed limit and following the displayed directions for the exit, the route off the estate meandered for miles across the property and took me 35 minutes to drive. Such elaborate staging might be in keeping with Olmsted's vision of carefully curated vistas and viewpoints, but it was also a reminder of the way that the Biltmore has always been about managing people as well as trees. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your wonderful presentation to you three. Mary, can you hear us well? Where you are? Okay, cool. So we have to talk in the microphone, so we're sure she will hear us. So we talked about a lot of subjects, the current life of both Biltmore and the Arboretum, dispossession of the land, economy of the land, public health for both projects, preservation and restoration of nature. I'm sure the audience will have plenty of questions. I would like to start with one, something that came to my mind when I saw your presentation. All these designs were projected for the very long term, 1,000-year lease for the Arboretum. I'm sure Biltmore was also understood as a long-term project with forestry restoration, not only for Biltmore, but for maybe the surrounding land of it. Yet, when designers start to design something, they start with very short-term concerns. The clients want something, or the institution, or there are things that have to be set for the first planting. Ned, you showed a map of species drawn by Sargent or Olmsted, I don't remember. Olmsted, okay. With every species that are carefully drawn and set on the map, with a comment that says, how about, I'm not sure about the species, Ostrea and Carpinus, everything else isn't there. Like if every species had to be set at this moment. Yet we know that the collections of plants change. And I was wondering in this design how they were anticipating the dynamic change in this collection of plants, of which plants are displayed, especially when we think the thing is going to exist for 1,000 years. And another question that is related, but maybe a bit different. Both projects have been existing for 150 years, 130 years. And I was wondering if we had witnessed major changes in the land, like erosion in this project. Are we expecting to witness major changes for the next 850 years? Are they meant to be warded off, or are they considered as stubborn phenomena of nature that have to be, with which we have to go along? I don't know if...
I could take the second.
Okay.
You take the first
Okay,
part.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
I failed to make it short. Okay, the first question was how at first in design the dynamic change of collection were taken into account when Olmsted and Sargent started to design it.
yeah, so, I mean, first of all, we live in tree time here, so everything that we're planting is, you already start with the assumption it's going to live for 200, 300, 400 years, some cases, a ginkgo tree, 1,000. And we know now that they weren't thinking about climate change, certainly. So we are thinking about these things. But one of the things that we do very effectively at the Arnold, while you plant with the taxonomic scheme, the microenvironments here are extremely well studied. So there are plenty of plants that are not necessarily with their compatriots. And they're sited, north, south. We know where the warmest cold spot is on the coldest day of the winter for all of our marginal plants. So there's a tremendous amount of thinking about how you find the right spot. And that's been part of our practice. That would have been known 100 years ago. That's one of the reasons we grow so many species. Much of the stuff that we grow here, no one can grow in Boston unless you have the right siting. So going forward, erosion, Bussy Brook is a case study in channelizing of upstream water and all of the things that urban environments have done to then destroy downstream. So we live with that. It's getting more complicated. We're losing paths, and the city, has got to help us on this. But at another level, this is a pretty stable place. As Rosetta really beautifully explicated, I mean, this territory, this topography has been around for thousands of years. Once the glaciers retreat, you have these beautiful hills that are just rubble that's left behind. So in 2,000 years, will things change in terms of topography? I doubt it. Will Bussy Brook do more damage? Yes, unless we work to fix it. But the wonderful thing about trees is they stabilize around them too. So I think we feel like, when we put something in, it comes as a seed in someone's hand. It gets to comes around the world, it goes into our propagation facility. We raise it to a sapling. We are thinking of siting it exactly so that 200 years from now, it's going to be happy.
I think it's worth mentioning that there's a difference between what Mary presented in the way that trees were planted for extraction at Biltmore specifically, and therefore placed for extraction, like ease of access, roads and whatnot, which she touched on. Whereas at the Arboretum, they're planted to grow. And for one reason or another, we've inherited the kind of disposable tree mentality. The average street tree in Boston, something like 7 years. That we can do better, right? We can do better. So if it's that easy to just replace it, then you don't treat it with care. You treat it as a replaceable object. So, I think that's just an interesting way maybe of bringing together the clearings in our conversations, but also to say that the change at the Arboretum that I've witnessed for 10 years is remarkable, let alone what Ned has seen and others here have seen. So erosion doesn't even start. I would say pathogens are a really big change maker. I had some slides up of it, but Hemlock Hill is so named because it was left as Hemlock Hill, and now Hemlock Hill is Sweet Birch Hill, really, because the woolly adelgid came in and took out the hemlocks. So all you can do is watch and study and learn and grow together as scientists and educate the public as you go as to why it's changing and why the adelgid is rapid. And then, what the Harvard Forest did in collaboration with the Arboretum was study the change and realize that the first succession would be sweet birch. And it's really remarkable because Hemlock Hill used to be dense and dark green, and now right now it's bright yellow. So it's a very different visitor experience, even on that kind of visceral level, let alone what the ecology is busy doing. There's a lot of change to see.
I don't know if, Mary, you want to jump on
I mean, I'll just add to that the time scales that Pinchot and Schenk are working with are a lot shorter because part of what they are facing pressure to prove is like this pace, and Vanderbilt is getting, he's not happy about the fact that there isn't actually a return, that the plantings, and like they can't find a market for the wood that's coming off of the property except for a very local market. And so there is a sense of this, this can create a beautiful forest and a sort of profitable forest in perpetuity if we get it right. But there's a very short temporal field of vision in terms of like, we have to, because this is a model, we have to sort of prove that this works. And Vanderbilt is very interested in sort of seeing the economic impact quickly, and grows quite frustrated when that doesn't bear out. I mean, it doesn't bear out, it's not profitable.
Okay. Thank you. Do someone have a question there? here and here.
So, Rosetta, you said something very important, which is the mow and blow maintenance issue, and which is devastating so many historic parks that have the genus of seeds from pre-European trees, which are being replaced in Olmsted parks all across New England and across America with cultivars grown outside. And it's hard to convince our municipal staff to stop mowing and to stop blowing. And I'm wondering, how do you guys do you deal with leaf litter here? And you know, is there a way to kind of really speak out about the problem of mowing and blowing and the need to regenerate whole forests from the seeds that are in the ground?
Yeah, that's beautifully put. I understand, and I think we all understand in the profession how difficult, you know, municipal budgets are very tight, and you know it's hard to have the kind of horticultural staff that is so educated that is remarkably stewarding the land here at the Arboretum. But that is very systemic to, you know, what young people are drawn into now. You know, they want to go into coding, not horticulture. So, you know, there's a societal ignorance about our living world that we should be starting early. The Arboretum does a great job with elementary school, but the respect for plants and that they seed. A lot of our public parks, they don't go to seed, right? Because our plants have been cultivated not to go to seed. So, for those that maybe we aren't addressing here, when you mow and blow. Sorry, it's becoming like a thing, but maybe when you blow, you're blowing away seed stock, right? And you're blowing away the very, very top O horizon that's slowly accumulating, and you're moving that away, and it takes a whole season to start that regenerative process of creating that sort of blanket for winter, and we dispose of it like it doesn't matter at all. It matters so much, and then we import mulch and other things to just have a different blanket on top that is full of zero nutrients and other living organisms like dormant seed. So it's complicated. I understand why municipal budgets are tight. However, the mow and therefore the blow were there to create more and more public space, like the Bussy Brook. I showed you it was so people could walk next to Bussy Brook. Well, now you can't walk next to Bussy Brook because it's full of wildflowers and ephemerals and annuals and perennials and widely planted, as widely as they'll spread. So you actually do have to recognize that the brook isn't just what you see, it's wetness through a much wider area, and those plants start to trace that wider area on their own, so humans don't go right near the brook, which is, you know, fine for this director, but in the 80s and 90s wasn't, you know. So this is what I tried to talk about with the relations. I think if we can reestablish relations, if we can name, like Terry Tempest Williams says, that the most radical thing you can do is name the plants and animals in your backyard. I mean, it's a pretty amazing thing to say, because most kids go out the front door and they can name the sneakers and the cars on the street way before they can name anything. And so it is an illiteracy that is so baked into society that it's just very hard. I get a little impassioned about it, but even if you're in a trade like horticulture, landscape architecture, that supposedly do steward and care for plants. So I wish I had an idea for you, but I'll just say education, and it starts young.
But it is also money, and it is knowledge. We went out and collected 100 species of native perennials to put under our solar panels. 100. That's an incredible investment of time. That means not only our horticulturists, great horticulturists, they have to be great natural historians. We then have to propagate all of that stuff. They have to be inserted. And these things in this current day don't maintain themselves. They have to be weeded. So what you're looking at there is an investment of that most municipalities with the way that they budget for these green public spaces, can't afford. What we're really talking about is if you want to do this, you have to make the decision to make these public spaces something more important than they are considered by almost every city in the world. And you'll see the herbaceous layer here. When I got here, it really was a lot of grass. And Andrew Kopinski, the director of horticulture here, he has tirelessly put us out there collecting germplasm for conservation purposes. There's a species, the New England blazing star, that's extirpated 100 years ago. It was last seen in Suffolk County, Boston. It's now growing right here, and it was last seen right here. And you can see the transition from meadows to lawns, and now we're going back. So it's knowledge, it's money, but sadly, I think it's also that many cities don't really see these spaces as doing the kinds of service around conservation, around the business of getting things back that, climate change is one thing, but, dropping a city on any kind of landscape pretty much extirpates everything, so.
Thank you.
Thank you all for really a great start to the day and wonderful presentations. I have a kind of follow-up question for you, Rosetta. You so beautifully put forward a notion that we could be advocates for non-sentient beings. I think it was the most poetic thing I've heard in a long time. And the notion of plant-based time is also extremely compelling. At the Arboretum, it seems just so fitting. Your description seems exactly fitting. And Ned speaks so well about the longevity of the work, of the intentions of the work, and the implications of the work, and the impacts of the work. But I wonder if you could, you imply, I think, a different kind of practice. And so I wonder what is the implication on design practice for your way of thinking about this? Let's say for the kinds of projects that you identified as being driven more by capitalism than by advocacy for plants.
I wish I had like a kind of like a Brene Brown kind of acronym or something for you. Like there's no easy way into this because we're really entangled in our mechanized past, right? The mowers and the blower. I mean, it's a big part of it is the quick fix machine that does it all, and labor issues and everything that's baked in. But as a start, I do think that a lot of landscape thinkers and landscape architects like yourself do understand the process that a park is, but it gets packaged as a product to the community. And like a mall, a park, it's a label on a map, right? It's just another program, it's another thing in the city that has an outline. And I think if we could start to change that to understand that it's a breathing organism as a whole, it's breathing, just breathing differently, the mall isn't, that you could start to have a conversation with the community that gives them a little more, like empower them to care, empower them to know how to care, which goes back to what Ned was saying. And I think as practices we have, as I'm a landscape architect, I mean we are far from the mud. And we are teaching our students to be far from the mud. And that's a problem that we're starting to see in the environment because maintenance has become a dirty word. It should be a dirty word, actually. And it's sort of like, oh, well, as long as there are phases, or as long as, like, I show the tree just getting bigger. Like, you didn't, there's so much more to growth, right? So the ways that we engender care across generations we're all educators, and also in our practices, I think that can leak into public processes. I've seen it sometimes, you've probably seen it sometimes, and when you can give the language to the public to care besides the word maintenance, I mean, that's it. There are whole books on maintenance. It's not just one word. So we need lists and lists of words that describe what we do so that they're not so easily objectified.
I think Annette or Alexander.
I was first. She's in front, so she doesn't see anyone behind.
I have to address your last question. Sorry that it's again Rosetta that is going to talk, but you said, can we learn to have parks by giving voice to others without history? Of course, as a historian, I jump on that now. But what did you mean exactly by that? Because when we walked with Ned through the Arboretum, and even in your own talk, you showed the compelling history, how the species got here, how they get out. How I just wanted you to clarify what you mean to, love the species without the history. What does it mean?
I was trying to make an analogy to Eric Wolf's work, right? He wrote this fantastic book, Europe and the People Without History, and at the time, which was the early 80s, it was, oh, there's a European history that hasn't been written. Well, of course, we know that, of course. But it did open up and create belonging at a time where people felt they didn't belong in histories. And so I'm using that to say there's also belonging that's more than human, and that we're shutting out other species at our peril, at our own peril. And so what would it mean to open up our histories, to not have a history of Olmsted's Park, but to have a history of a white oak in an Olmsted Park? Like, I want to read that history in the 21st century. I don't want to look at the plan anymore. I mean, that's personal. I mean, the plan is beautiful, but I want to understand how it superimposes and what is lost in the cracks.
I agree. So then you would add more history, but the history
would
of
add
the
more
plants
history.
and the species and the thing. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I jump in just on this point? Can you hear me? One of the things that I was really interested as well in this idea of like non-sentient beings, because there's been such a conversation in literary studies about plant sentience. I'm thinking of Michael Pollan's piece, like, is the plant intelligent? Sort of this polemical piece. But Suzanne Simard's recent autobiography, Richard Powers' Pulitzer Prize winning The Overstory, Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, which are all giving models of ideas of sentience. And I mean, it's a loaded term. What does sentience mean? But I just wanted to sort of mention there's a 19th century corollary to this in both sort of history of science and in literature. Like, there are periodicals where people are sort of looking at Asa Gray's studies and saying, like, is the plant intelligent? It knows what it wants and it knows how to get it. And there are 19th century literary works where a man falls in love with a plant because the plant is, his benefactress, and it does all of these things. And so there's this real struggle to find language that will sort of capture the liveliness of plants that in one way is really familiar, and in the other way is ultimately alien or very strange. And I think it's that there's that tension that makes plants really interesting to sort of think with in terms of these questions of care and ethics. So just to sort of piggyback on that wonderful conversation.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the interesting things. Sentience, if it's going to be defined with neurons, is a very narrow definition, and I can work with that definition. But the idea that plants perceive without neurons is a very beautiful thing. And what I think, coming back to, you want a biography of that oak, one of the things we did when we redid our website, we have plant biographies. Every garden can give you a species list and the zones that something grows in. We have biographies of individual organisms. For me, as an organismic biologist, It's all about giving standing to that oak tree, to that seed in your hand, and having respect for it. And it doesn't have to have neurons to be an extremely beautiful, highly advanced, on a par behavioral. As it turns out, I study interparental conflict in plants. Everyone laughs, but in fact, plants' mate choice is every bit as careful as ours. It just doesn't require neurons. There are whole books on mate choice. There are whole books about how mothers and fathers disagree about how they provision for their progeny. This is an area, again, people are surprised because we come with the assumption that intelligence is neuron-based. But forget about it. 4 billion years of evolution, if you aren't very intelligent in a sense, you're extinct.
Well, thank you for this optimistic ending and for the great discussion we had.